Hi, I'm Sai, and this is my motorhome joy, and welcome to my YouTube channel called Nuggets of Wisdom. I'm pretty excited to share with you, I think, the most fundamental nugget of wisdom that I could share. And that is my understanding with respect to the nature of truth. Surprisingly, truth and understanding truth is probably one of the most fundamental things in the world. And every day in your life and in our lives, we're bombarded with information, stories, videos, documentaries, news articles, scientific papers, blogs, social media posts, on, that are all trying to express some sort of truth. But the amazing thing is, in reality, is for me, I never really understood or had any idea what truth really was. I just kind of took for granted that I knew what truth was. I think my analogy would be like building a house without a foundation. The foundation is probably the most expensive structural part, and really, once the house is built, you never see it. But the foundation is fundamental. If you don't have a foundation, your house isn't going to last very long. And I think it's the same. It has been the same for me in my life. I've had all these influences around me when it comes to what I believe in, based on the truths that I discover or am told. And then I, like everybody else, base moral arguments and how I navigate the world around those. But also, if you base your world around these truths and you build your moral arguments and your narratives around what's right and what's wrong and what's justified and what's justified, that can bring a lot of stress and anxiety into your life. And so if you want to live a peaceful life, if you want to live a happy life, I think it's really important to start to get some sort of handle on how we perceive truth. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a summary of how what my perception is. I'll also leave some links for you so that you can hear other people's perceptions, and some people go into quite great detail about the nature of truth. But for me, fundamentally, I would say there's sort of three areas here that I look at. So I've created my own sort of idea of what truth is. These three areas are sort of what they call fundamental truth. That's area one. And fundamental truth is discussed by philosophers and physicists and so on, because it relates to the whole nature of being. So who are we? Do we exist? Is this a matrix? Is it Maya, as the spiritualists say? Is there a God? And all that kind of stuff, and how we perceive the world. And it is important. I think it's important from a philosophical point of view, and having some idea about, where we sit in the universe, and if there is a universe, and what the nature of the universe is. But from the point of view of living in this world, even if you called it a game, living in this game, it's not that important, because within the world there are sets of rules by which we live, and therefore knowing fundamental truths, in a way, I can just park that. And I think it's very interesting to delve into, and I do, and I'm very interested in it, but I'm not going to discuss that in detail here. So the other two phases to me are what I call two sort of types of relative truth. So when I say relative truth, what I'm saying is that in life, it is very difficult to determine if something is actually true. I'll give you a really great example. Colour, for example. If I look at the sky, I think the sky is blue. Well, it's well known that people's perception of colour can vary, and especially if you live in a tribe or a country in a different place, they might see a different shade of blue to me. We've all agreed about the colour blue, And there may be lots of creatures and animals who don't see colour or understand colour in the way we do. So a lot of the things that we use to navigate the world are relatively true. But the fundamentals of those truths, again, we really, in my view, are important. I can understand, but basically, I'm not going to go into detail with them here. So, relative truths. How I look at relative truth is, first of all, I don't have what's called a dualistic approach. So, yes, this is relatively true. No, this is not relatively true. Because I think, again, it's more complicated than that. So what I tend to do is I tend to have kind of an imaginary score in my mind. So I'll say, okay, there are some basic relative truths that are kind of relate to our sensory experience of the world. So if I put my hand in a hot stove at 200 degrees, I will get burnt. That is pretty straightforward relative truth. And I would give that a very high score. If I was to pick other examples of relative truths, I might give them a very low score. But basically, I look at this as almost like in a scoring from 0 to 100. So if I really believe something may be very true, I'll give it a high score. If I really believe something is not so true, I'll give it a low score. So why do I do that? Because, as I say, actually understanding truth and relative truth is quite complex, and I'll just go into some detail on that. So, for example, where do we get all our information that gives us an idea of what truth is? Well, historically, we get it from our childhoods, we get it from history, we get it from our country, we get it from our religion, and so on. And those relative truths change quite a bit. So, if you look at the big topics of the world over the last few centuries, we've had slavery, we've had gay rights, we've had marital rights, we've had feminism, we've had lots of people burnt at the stake for their views on certain things, and those relative truths changed. In those times, people used those relative truths to create morals, and then those morals set out often a sort of a set of rules about how society worked. There was a strong element of good versus evil, so very dualistic, and people would decide what was good and what was evil based on their morals and based on the truths that they had basically decided happened to guide them to decide what was morally good and what morally bad. The second, so that's historical, and again, we're brought up in our childhoods, our parents and our conditioning and our childhood programming and whatever traumas we have and whatever experiences we have also tend to create a scenario where we kind of navigate the world and reflect those experiences out and then suck in what we feel suits some of those conditionings, those programmings that we have. So it's very easy for somebody to be quite biased when it comes to what they believe is true. Good example is if you were brought up in a very strong religious background, that you were really, trained and educated that it was important, and then there's another religious group that you're not so keen on, your family's not so keen on, your society's not so keen on. Very easy to basically then sort of build a whole load of relative truths around this other group and then create morals that allow you to basically disassociate from them or discriminate from them or identify them as a group of people you don't want having to do it or have relationships with. All based on the way you've been brought up and the kinds of factors that influenced your life. The other place we get our relative truths from is newspapers, social media, news channels, radio and TV, the internet, YouTube, Instagram, all these forums that we can, technical papers that we read, and so documentaries and so on. And what's interesting about these places is they're now becoming more and more and more and more diverse. And we have a world where we've got a sea of different places in order to get these relative truths from. And they're all competing. And a lot of the time, because we live in a capitalist society, they're all competing on a monetary basis. So eyeballs, how many people are looking at my blog, at my video channel, and monetization, how much money can I get? Advertising. Well, there's a tag to something. If I show you how to cook something, or running, or cycling, or sports of any kind, or watching programs, entertainment, and so on, there'll be some sort of purchase linked to that through some sort of advertisement process or tagging process that leads to an advertisement that gets you to buy something. There's also a great temptation to use the freedoms that we have now with social media and other channels that are very easy to post things, very easy to upload things, upload video from your phone and so on. Very, very easy for people to put up their own stories and push them out with a view to reflecting again their own views, and so creating stories that are sort of have a relative truth to them. And then you have religious organizations, you have political organizations, you have nationalistic organizations, countries and states that all have agendas about how they want people to view the world and what it means for them when it comes to power and control and getting elected in elections, and their donors and the people who influence them. So it's a very, very complicated sort of world. And you could justifiably get to a point in society where you go, I just don't believe anything. Especially now when artificial intelligence is getting sort of to a point where soon you'll be able to create video, of the US president meeting aliens on the White House lawn and having tea with them, and it will look completely real. But it will be all fake. And it'll be hard to tell what is actually the relative truth and what isn't. So people often say the truth will set you free, and it's very true. But this truth can also make you a prisoner, and can create a world where, because we're very tribal, we've been hunter-gatherers for thousands of years, and we like to stick in our little groups, and our belief system and our sort of, bunching together with certain views of what is right and what's wrong, makes us feel safe. Then it's very easy to manipulate us into believing certain things. And if you look at the internet today, it's very interesting. You see a very common sort of trend, which is very much dualistic arguments, where one side says the other side is bad. So one side is bad, the other side is good. And they kind of demonize each other, or they create stories about how one side is doing certain things in order to make life difficult for the other side. When in reality, we kind of know that's not really what's happening. That there's not just a simple dualistic process taking place here, that both sides probably have elements of truth and elements of kind of lies. And sometimes, because of ego and because of conditioning and because of other influences, neither side really knows what the truth is. In fact, sometimes they don't even have the right evidence, or the evidence they have is very subjective. And so you end up with these very dualistic arguments, which often do not reflect a high-scoring relative truth that we can have confidence in. And so in that kind of world, it's very, very difficult to basically get to a point where you can say, great, here's these truths that I think are relatively correct and have a high score. Therefore, I'm going to build some arguments around these about how I live my life, who I donate money to, what charities I give money to, who I vote for in an election, whether I agree or I disagree with something, whether I'll write to my MP, whether I'll tell other people in the pub about my views on something. Very difficult to do. So, for me, I've kind of created a kind of process that I think improves things and can reduce a lot of anxiety. Because, in the world of advertising, it's far easier to convince somebody of some negative outcome than it is of a positive, because they use the fear sort of drive within us, our fear of abandonment, our tribal sense of security, to hit us with negative stories, often frighten us or stress us, because we are attracted to those. It's a survival process, survival strategy. And so you can end up having a life which is filled with anxiety. I've seen people who listen to the news, local news channel, where most of the stories really should be about things that are quite positive, but they pick up on very negative stories. And the people who watch these regional channels I've seen are just every day frightened. I used to know a beautiful old lady, and she was 86 or whatever. And she'd sit down watching the regional news every night, and it just frightened her, because there was always negative stories about drug taking and somebody who was missing and a car accident and so on. And her life was just full of anxiety. There was nothing she could do about any of these things. Nothing, very little. And she couldn't even properly investigate whether they were true or false. And in reality, they weren't false. I mean, people die every day. People are killed in traffic accidents. People go missing. But what happens is you have a selectivity with these things, where people pick out of, 50 highly important things that happen in your community every day, pick the few that are basically quite stressy and negative, put those out to get people watching your story so that you can make more money, so you can make more advertising revenue. But the end result is that you end up with anxiousness and anxiety and stress, where people just don't know what's going on in the world, and they're worried. And so for me, what has really helped me is to have a Sherlock Holmes approach. Or you may have heard of the guy, I think it was Poirot, with that wonderful moustache. He was a French detective, or something like Columbo in America. He was a sort of tatty, very clever detective with an old banged up car and a dog. And basically what these guys did was they meticulously looked at all the information, and they figured out, from piecing almost a jigsaw puzzle together and independent evidence, who the murderer was. And often in these stories, it was never the person you expected it to be. It was somebody completely different. So I take a kind of similar approach when it comes to getting a handle on what I feel might be true or not. So you can look at the source of the evidence for something. So if, for example, there's a story saying 5,000 people were killed in a war in some country, you can look at the evidence coming from both sides, from the two countries that are part of this warring. You can get some information from, say, the UN, or from a body that independently looks at the number of casualties. You can also find out from independent journalists who are in the area and independent media reporters what is really going on, if these numbers actually stack up. And you can start to come to conclusions and give a rating to how true or how false something might be. You can never say, I believe it's actually correct or it's actually false in a lot of these more complex relative truths. But you can say, well, on the basis of probability, I think it's more likely to be this case. I think you've also got to be very careful when it comes to, as I mentioned earlier, the AI part of this, and making sure that when you do pick places to get your information from, that you're not actually picking just false information to start with. That's not a good place to be. So for me, by understanding this, I can sort of get a vibe. So one thing that really does sort of ring alarm bells in my head is when I see organizations, media organizations I know are funded by privately or have lots of advertising going on, and in those they're dogmatically pushing one point of view, or the reporter is asking leading questions, and often very quickly I switch off. Where I see media organizations very transparent and clear about their funding and have maybe both sides of the story, they have people from both sides having a discussion. The debate is often left to those two people, and the presenter or the person who's actually managing the discussion just asks questions and stands back. They give me more confidence. When I see reporters who are basically taunting the guests and bringing in just one side straight away, either they're creating some sort of, stressful moment that will pull eyeballs to their articles, or they've got some sort of vested interest, whether it's political or monetary. So you've got to be very, very, very careful with that. So from these relative truths and my scoring, and then looking at lots of different sources of information, I can start to build a picture that gives me some much more confidence than I would have otherwise. But also, I have a feedback mechanism. So if I listen to an article, listen to some advice from an independent media reporter, or from a documentary or whatever, and some of the predictions they made, some of the information they've provided keeps getting corroborated as being true, then I get more confidence in that organization the next time I'll go there and say, that's interesting. I might listen to them and see what they have to say. So all of this then, it brings me to a place where I have more confidence in the stories that I'm being told. Another really important part of this for me is that I avoid the things that I have no influence over, because every day we're being bombarded with so many different stories, and a lot of the time there's nothing we can do to influence those stories. So I'm very careful about what I pick. Say, okay, I have some influence. I can donate money to this charity. I can write to my local MP. I can tell my friends not to buy this particular product. But a lot of things we have no control over, or very little. And so you have to be mindful of these things. Otherwise, there's such a layer of anxiety that comes into your life. And that layer of anxiety then, it's also basically configured to get you to buy stuff. I often think that in society, if we had a stress-free society, the economy would collapse. Because people would just sit in the garden every day and just have a picnic. And they wouldn't be so focused on all of the crazy things we have to do to make ourselves feel better. So you have this crazy mechanism where, to feel better because of all the stuff that you're hearing about how terrible the world is, you have to buy stuff. You have to have experiences. You have to go to the restaurant. You have to get more food. You have to raid the fridge later, and you have to drink more alcohol. And so you can see, unfortunately, how easy it is for our society and for people to become extremely stressed, extremely anxious, spend loads of money, take hits, like mini drug hits, of pleasurable things in order to quench that anxiety to a certain degree. Often enmeshed in all sorts of, incorrect stories that basically are being used to sort of corral us and to do certain things that are all very much linked to a monetary or a political kind of, or a tribal kind of, justification. And so, just to sort of finish off on this, I would say, be very, very careful about what you perceive to be truth, and do your homework, look at lots of different strands of evidence, make sure those evidence sources are as independent as possible, build up trust based on how those organizations have reported and what has actually been proven to be true or false. Do not get yourself enmeshed in things you can't do anything about. But also, there's so much positive experience in the world. We live in a fantastic world. There's so many fantastic things happening in our world. So, pull yourself into that world of looking at the positive as well. So every day when you decide to go on the internet, look at something that you can see is interesting. Studies about nature of the world and science, and positive technologies that are being rolled out, and stories about animals and creatures and forests, and human stories about people who have overcome problems and had a beautiful experience and thrived. Move away from this survival trap to this thriving experience. And that, again, for you and your mental health, is a very, very positive thing, and brings lots of benefits to you in your life. So I hope my first nugget of wisdom will be helpful to you, and I look forward to sharing another one with you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.